2007, a man from Philadelphia stood in front of an audience and began a presentation that would eventually become one of the most widely circulated pieces of esoteric research on the internet. His name was Mark Passio, and the presentation was called Demystifying the Occult. What made it stand out wasn't just the subject matter, it was who was delivering it. Passio wasn't an academic historian of religion or a folklorist studying symbolism from a comfortable distance. By his own account, he'd once been ordained as a priest inside Anton LaVey's Church of Satan under the name Mark Rochar, before walking away from that world entirely and spending the rest of his career trying to explain what he says he learned while he was inside it. Let's start with what the occult actually means, because Passio's whole project depends on getting past a common misunderstanding right out of the gate. The word occult simply means hidden or concealed. It comes from the Latin occultus. It doesn't inherently mean evil, satanic, or supernatural, even though pop culture has flattened it into shorthand for exactly those things. Passio draws a sharp distinction between occultism and mysticism. Mysticism, in his framing, is the pursuit of hidden spiritual knowledge for the purpose of personal growth and understanding, made freely available to anyone willing to study it. Occultism, by contrast, is the deliberate concealment of that same category of knowledge, kept from the general public and used instead by a small number of people to gain and maintain advantage and power over everyone else. Under that framing, the problem was never the knowledge itself. Symbolism, numerology, ritual, esoteric philosophy, none of that is inherently harmful. The problem, as Passio presents it, is asymmetry. A small group holding knowledge that the rest of society has been actively kept from understanding. The core of his argument is that symbols function as a kind of hidden language, and that once you learn to read that language, you start noticing it everywhere. Corporate logos, architecture, currency, government insignia, entertainment media. Passio spends a significant portion of his presentations walking through specific examples, tracing symbols back through ancient religious and esoteric traditions, and arguing that modern institutions continue using them deliberately. Aware of a meaning the general public was never taught to recognize. To Passio, this isn't paranoid pattern matching. He argues it's the natural consequence of a documented historical practice. Secret societies and esoteric orders have existed for centuries. Plenty of them are historically real and well documented, and it would be strange, in his view, to assume that tradition of concealed symbolic communication simply stopped mattering in the modern era. That's a claim worth pausing on, honestly, because it's the hinge his entire argument turns on, and it's also the part that's hardest to verify. Historians generally agree that secret societies, esoteric orders, and symbolic traditions are real and well-documented parts of history. Organizations like Freemasonry, various mystery schools, and ceremonial magic traditions genuinely existed and genuinely used structured symbolism. What's much harder to establish with any real evidence is Passio's further claim that a coordinated network of powerful institutions today is actively using that same symbolic language deliberately and secretly to influence the public at a mass scale. That version of the claim moves from documented history into something closer to pattern interpretation, where the same symbol, a circle, a pyramid, a specific number, gets treated as meaningful evidence wherever it appears, without an agreed-upon standard for distinguishing a deliberate coded message from an ordinary, coincidental design choice. Symbols like circles, triangles, and eyes appear constantly across completely unrelated design traditions worldwide, often for entirely mundane visual or historical reasons that have nothing to do with esoteric intent. That doesn't make Passio's specific claims false. It just means they're the kind of claims that are extremely difficult to test, and that's worth knowing going in. Where Passio's work becomes less about symbol decoding and more distinctly his own is, in the second half of his overall project, his teachings on what he calls natural law. This is where his background genuinely shapes his conclusions in an interesting way. Passio argues that the same occulted knowledge used to manipulate and control people can, once exposed and understood, be turned into a framework for personal and moral freedom instead. Natural law, in his teaching, isn't a legal system handed down by any government or religion. It's presented as an objective, self-evident moral order, built on the basic idea that no person has the right to initiate harm, force, or coercion against another. He spends enormous energy distinguishing this from what he calls order following, a mindset he considers one of the deepest roots of large-scale harm throughout history. People committing or permitting harmful acts not out of personal malice, but simply because an authority told them to, without applying independent moral judgment of their own. This part of his message tends to land very differently than the symbolism material. It's less about decoding hidden meanings in a corporate logo and more a fairly direct ethical argument. Think for yourself, question authority, and take responsibility for your own actions rather than outsourcing your conscience to an institution. It's worth sitting with why this combination, occult symbolism plus a moral philosophy of personal responsibility, has resonated with as large an audience as it has over nearly 2 decades now. Part of it is simply that Passio doesn't ask his audience to take his claims on faith the way a religious tradition might. He presents himself as building an argument from first principles, walking through definitions, distinctions, and historical examples in long-form lecture-style presentations that can run many hours. That format itself signals a kind of rigor to viewers, even when the underlying claims about coordinated modern manipulation remain difficult to independently verify. And part of it is his own biography, which functions as a powerful rhetorical device whether or not every detail can be externally confirmed. A man who says he stood inside the very institution he warns his audience about, offering what feels to his audience like a first-hand account rather than outside speculation. So where does that leave an honest look at Mark Passio and demystifying the occult? The historical foundation underneath his work is real. Esoteric traditions, secret societies, and symbolic systems genuinely exist and genuinely have influenced art, architecture, and institutional design throughout history, and that's not in serious dispute among historians. What's far less settled is the leap from that documented history to the claim that a coordinated modern power structure is actively wielding that same symbolic language today to manipulate mass populations without their knowledge or consent. That's an extraordinary claim, and it remains, by its very nature, resistant to the kind of concrete evidence that would let anyone outside Passio's own testimony confirm or deny it either way. What tends to hold up regardless of where you land on the symbolism claims is the more grounded half of his message. That moral responsibility can't simply be outsourced to authority, and that understanding the tools historically used to manipulate people is, at minimum, a useful form of self-defense. Whether or not you buy the deeper architecture of hidden control Passio describes, that particular piece of advice doesn't require believing in a conspiracy to be worth taking seriously.